Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving right into the foundational paradox of the United States. We're talking about that massive, defining clash between its highest, most celebrated ideals and, well, its harshest realities. And look, this isn't just some dusty history lesson. This is literally the blueprint for the ongoing American civil rights journey. So let's get into it.
We've got to start with the hook, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. You know the rest. These are arguably the most famous words in American history. Penned mostly by Thomas Jefferson back in 1776, this quote from the Declaration of Independence is this incredibly inspiring promise of universal liberty. I mean, it was a totally radical idea for its time. Rooted in Enlightenment thinking, it basically suggested that our rights don't come from some king sitting on a throne, but are just inherent to humanity. It's a soaring, beautiful sentiment.
But right away, we run into a really difficult question. Who was actually included in that grand promise? When the founders wrote all men, who exactly were they talking about? And, perhaps more importantly, who was intentionally left out of this new democratic experiment at the very dawn of the nation? There is such a jarring disconnect here. On one hand, you have this stated ideal, universal liberty, equality, unalienable rights. But the lived reality? It was starkly, brutally different. We're talking about millions of African and African-American people held in generational chattel slavery. Millions. Indigenous populations were facing violent displacement and the total erosion of their sovereignty. And women, who make up literally half the population, were entirely disenfranchised, lacking even basic legal autonomy.
Which brings us to Section 1, Codifying Exclusion, and the Laws of the New Nation.
You see, these early exclusions, they weren't just accidental social norms. They were baked directly into the legal framework of the country. When the delegates met in 1787 to draft the Constitution, they were looking at a deeply divided country, mostly split right down the middle over the issue of slavery. And to hold this fragile union together, well, the founders compromised on basic human rights. The result was the Three-Fifths Compromise. This meant an enslaved person was legally counted as three-fifths of a free individual for the purpose of legislative representation and taxation. They essentially placed national unity over moral justice, which ended up giving slaveholding states massively disproportionate political power.
Just think about that fraction for a second. 3/5. It's a stark, honestly grotesque mathematical quantification of human beings. Their humanity was being systematically denied, and yet their physical presence was being used to bolster Southern political dominance in the House of Representatives. It represents this pragmatic but deeply tragic political calculus that permanently scarred the nation's legal foundation.
And the crazy thing is, that compromise wasn't an outlier. The Constitution explicitly protected the transatlantic slave trade from federal interference for 20 whole years, right up until 1808. It also included a fugitive slave clause. This effectively made northern free states complicit in the institution of slavery by legally mandating the return of escapees. And voting rights? Forget about it. They were largely restricted to a very small elite, basically just white, male property owners. The law of the land systematically prioritized economic interests, elite power, and racial hierarchy over any genuine sense of equality.
And this systemic exclusion absolutely extended to gender, too. The prevailing ideal of the time was something called Republican motherhood. Now, women were revered, sure, but strictly within the domestic sphere. They were tasked with raising these virtuous male citizens, but they were completely shut out of the democratic process themselves. I mean, they were unable to vote, hold office, or even maintain basic legal autonomy once they got married.
Let's move on to Section 2, the expansion of injustice and growing the divide.
So, as the United States rapidly grew in the early 19th century, these systemic injustices didn't just linger, they actually deepened. The real turning point hit in 1793. The invention of the cotton gin completely revolutionized Southern agriculture overnight. Suddenly, processing cotton was immensely profitable, which caused the demand for enslaved labor to just absolutely explode. Even with the transatlantic slave trade officially banned in 1808, the domestic slave trade grew exponentially. It built this massive, highly profitable, and frankly unimaginably brutal cotton kingdom. And, well, to grow all that cotton, the nation needed land. A lot of it. This relentless expansion westward was driven by this philosophy of manifest destiny. Basically the belief that Euro-American expansion across the continent was totally inevitable and divinely ordained. But of course, this expansion came at an incredibly high cost. It meant the tragic, violent dispossession of indigenous nations. They were pushed from their ancestral lands through broken treaties, coerced concessions, and outright military force, completely excluding them from the Republic's grand promise of liberty.
Okay, Section 3, the spark of resistance and fighting for freedom.
Now, it's absolutely crucial to remember that this history isn't just a grim catalog of oppression.
It's actually a story of incredible human agency. And Black leadership was at the absolute forefront of this. Figures like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth. They didn't just suffer in silence, they actively organized. With this fierce eloquence and brilliant intellect, they literally weaponized the nation's own founding ideals against its current practices. They pointed out the glaring hypocrisy of a supposedly free nation practicing chattel slavery, and they demanded that the promises of 1776 actually be applied to everyone.
And this resistance took on some incredibly daring physical forms too, like the high-stakes operations of the Underground Railroad. Now, as you probably know, this wasn't an actual train, but a highly decentralized grassroots network. We're talking about fleeing bondage via covert, secret routes in the dead of night, seeking sanctuary in hidden safe houses, and communicating through coded songs and signs just to avoid detection. And at the helm of all this, utterly fearless conductors like Harriet Tubman, who risked her own life over and over again to lead others to freedom. It's just awe-inspiring.
But operating this network was incredibly dangerous, especially after the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. This was a draconian law that basically criminalized aiding runaways. It actually mandated that escaped individuals be returned to bondage, even if they had successfully made it to a free state. It forced these resistance networks even deeper underground. Yet, despite these severe federal penalties constantly pushing back against them, these activists risked absolutely everything. They proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that the human spirit's drive for freedom simply cannot be legislated away.
Which leads us to Section 4, broadening the fight and intersecting movements.
You know, this fierce spirit of abolition, it was contagious. A lot of the early advocates for women's rights actually first found their political voice right there within the abolitionist movement. Realizing that they too were being excluded from the basic rights of citizenship, pioneers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott decided to take action. So in 1848, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention in New York. This was a huge deal. It was the first women's rights convention of its kind in the United States, and it fundamentally challenged the patriarchal exclusion that had basically defined the nation since its birth. And the real brilliance of their strategy at Seneca Falls was in the wording. They drafted something called the Declaration of Sentiments. And how did they do it? They took Thomas Jefferson's hallowed 1776 Declaration, the one that stated all men are created equal, and they simply added 2 words, and women. It's brilliant. They completely repurposed the founders' exact language to put a massive spotlight on the glaring gender blind spot of the American Revolution.
And that brings us to the core takeaway of this entire explainer. Listen, the American civil rights journey, it is not some completed project tucked safely away in the history books. No way. It's an ongoing, highly dynamic battle. Really, the entire arc of American history is essentially this grand struggle to reconcile those lofty, soaring ideals of 1776 with the lived, often exclusionary realities of its people. That initial paradox we started with, that's the engine that has driven 2.5 centuries of social progress. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final, pretty provocative thought to chew on. How do the contradictions of 1776 still shape the fight for equality today? Because when we debate voting rights, systemic justice, or equal representation right now in the 21st century, we're still navigating the exact same fault lines laid down at the nation's founding. The journey absolutely continues. And understanding this history, well, that's the very first step in knowing where we go next.